Ladies and gentlemen, it's another episode of The Big Boys Table. It is episode 66, and that means that's 3 away from 69. Mesk, welcome to an episode all about control. I'm sure you're familiar with having lots of control in your life and in your history. And so that's why I thought you were the perfect person to talk to about control. And specifically... we'll go through some examples of Apex. We'll go through some talks of general stuff, like looking at all sorts of games. Obviously, like something that always jumps to my mind is Dark Souls, because if it doesn't feel like you have very much control in a game like that at all, yet it's obviously very mainstream and very popular. So I'm sure we'll go through a couple of examples in the public space as well, right? The more modern industry area. However, I should talk a bit about what precipitated this discussion of control in the first place. So a while back, maybe it was probably only a few days ago, a Knight of the Realm, who is on our Not Fraud development team, he mentioned that
Knight of the Fraud.
Yeah, he's mentioned that he's really looking forward to whenever we release our first RTS game, because the smooth controls will undoubtedly be better. And it got me thinking that, like, obviously, when you compare StarCraft 2 to Brood War, the unit handling is very different, and I'm sure some people would argue that StarCraft 2's unit handling feels better in many ways, although, of course, we both have observed that there's lots of flaws with it. But one thing that, generally speaking, that they don't have the issue with is the units, like, weirdly spinning out or doing something that's clearly not what you want. Or maybe rubbing up weirdly against themselves. Like, there's those weird videos that you'll see every now and then where it's like two hydras like walking into themselves and down, and then one of them speeds really far up, like gets like turbo speed for no reason. I don't even know how that pathing issue happens. And then obviously there's all the other edge cases, like 30 Dragoons getting stuck in a ramp in a pro game and the guy having to GG out. And like shit like that, where it's like, how the fuck did you allow this to happen in your game?
I mean, just in one of those videos I sent you that never got released, where like I was trying to move a probe around your geyser, and the probe just like got hooked on it and just was stuck.
I don't know why like probes or scribes, either one of them. This doesn't change it in CMBW. They always derp out the most out of any worker. I feel like they will spaz out against gateways. Really, if you ever move them to like the leftmost edge of the gateway, if you ever move them to the right. From that point, they will just do nothing. Honestly, it feels like
it's like some math just has some weird error in their pathing or something when it hits really a specific point.
Yeah, I don't know why, because they have the same collision as other workers, so it doesn't even make sense. But anyhow, the things that I've seen in Brood War have definitely led me to believe that unit control could definitely be more refined, and those are. There are steps I've taken in Cosmonarchy Brood War, in fact, to try to push it into that direction, where obviously we like smoothed out the movement of the, like we avoided emulated root motion, is sort of the term we decided to use for it, where it's like different amounts of movement per animation frame. Yeah. And that's just because Brood War's pathfinding can't handle that. We are hoping that we can handle that, because it does allow you to have animations that feel a lot more interesting. So if the pathfinding can just predict that or in some way, or like not explode because of that, then you won't have what you have with Brood War, where the Dragoon just obviously spazzes out, or the Goliath spazzes out, or even the Ultralisk will do the same thing, and all because they move at different amounts or whatever at different steps of the animation. So these are all things that speak to me as like, these are very specific examples, but it's where the system falls apart. And I think about that, and I think about how unit control. In some like there is that element where you want to make sure that you're replacing some sort of like menial chore task, which would be like making sure that you babysit all your units up ramps or whatever. You want to replace that with something that's actually meaningful, because otherwise you may be lowering the or taking the skill ceiling and lowering it a little bit too much, right? Like, you still want unit control to be like a skill that you have to test well, that you have to pass the test well as a player. And so I think that like one of the best things about making the units behave a little bit more intelligently on their own is that it opens up the room, this real estate, for the player to make more interesting decisions, and thus to have a better time to maybe, like, something that I remember you saying a while back, and this isn't super related to like unit movement or whatever, but we updated some internal like behavior timers to run every frame or every tick, instead of happening like on a weird cooldown inconsistently. And one of those things was like just attack move timer, and it made like anybody who was A moving could basically immediately destroy spider mines. And that was one of those things that's like most people wouldn't even think about that interaction, but it does happen. And that means that like now the role of spider mines is a little bit different, right? Because now it's more about like if you want to use them offensively, then you have to get them before the spider mine can get one shot. You also have to get them, or maybe you can fight over them with your units, and then like obviously the auto target priority will always prefer the unit that they can see immediately, and so the spider mine will probably squeeze by, unless they're really really precise with their attack targets. And so stuff like that is like, okay, well, is this actually a net upgrade or what? And like that's a more gray area because I haven't even decided how I feel about the fact that everybody just clears mines very easily. But it does have that knock-on effect. You kind of think about that, like, okay, now like this changes how I can even use this tool because the units themselves are a little bit more responsive. So obviously I touched a little bit on that. There was a recent Salt episode where the Shambler was very mad that his Panoptises did not stop immediately to fire and instead tried to get a little bit closer to the units, which is just like par for the course for Brood War. Anything that uses the flingy movement type, which is like air units, workers, Vulture, Archon, anything that hovers basically. Those kinds
fucking
of units,
shuttles.
those kinds of units will have that weird drifting behavior, and we actually made it better in CMBW insofar as the drifting is less, but wasn't enough for good old Shambler there, and so obviously ended up getting owned. And I definitely don't want people to lose games because of something like that. Or feel like they lost the game because of something like that, where like, I told my unit to do something and he didn't do the thing. That does feel pretty bad. But obviously that's like a very vague statement where you can unpack that a lot of ways more specifically and say like, okay, well, maybe I told my unit to do it, but my click wasn't exactly precise or something. And that's why it was a bad input on the player side as opposed to a bad like output or whatever from what the units did as a result of that. So how do you feel about the RTS control specifically regarding, something like Brood War? It hasn't, I think you'll agree, it hasn't really changed that much in Cosmonarchy Brood War, but maybe you'll think of a few things that are related to that from your time playing and casting that. And then like comparing that maybe to, obviously you've spent a lot of time with StarCraft 2, and anything come to mind as far as the specifics of like what you would avoid if you were trying to say, like if I sat you down and I said, Mesk, I'm designing my RTS game as I am, and I'm designing my RTS engine as I am. How can we make it so that the control scheme, like the actual player inputs, are handled in a more elegant way? Like what are warning signs we would want to avoid if we feel like we're making the unit movement too easy, for lack of a better term? And what are some pitfalls to avoid for like, okay, if you want your unit control to be like skill testing, avoid this because that's just going to turn it into a chore. Does anything come to your mind based on all of that primer?
I think one of the things that really stood out to me getting back into Brood War is how units try to find paths when they get blocked by something, and how they will take really weird paths and then get lost.
Yeah.
Like again, in one of those videos when I'm attacking you in my my land units, I switched back because I can't remember, maybe it's like when your vultures dropped me or something like that. And I look back down and I've got two Atriuses that have gone like all the way across the fucking screen backwards. One of them is stuck in a corner he can't get out of, and the other is just like spinning around way out of the way. And it's like, it would have been much better that if they were stuck, they would just kind of just sit there and then wait, or try to just path in that area. Like there was just a point where it's like they're not going to get into where they're supposed to go, no way, without going all the way around the map. And they're not even trying to go all the way around the map. They're just like, this just complete shit just completely falls apart. So the pathing system should be smart enough to, the main thing you want to avoid is automation. So what you don't want to have is, I tried to move stuff here and stuff's in the way, so it's automatically going to move and make way for these units. No, that's bad. And that takes everything out of the hands
of the push
of the
priority system and all that from StarCraft 2. Yeah.
Yeah, that's tremendously bad. I mean, it's great for the AI because the AI is too stupid to do basic stuff like that. But in the hands of the player, it just automates everything about the game completely. Any time you start breaching away from convenience into automation, you're already in really bad territory. You should be starting the arguments before when you reach convenience. So what does convenience mean? Well, it was really obvious immediately off the bat, despite the fact I haven't played StarCraft for quite a long time, is that the mine acquisition was totally different. It was just unbelievably different. Immediately, I noticed that both Hydras and Dragoons were targeting mines in ways that they never did prior. And initially, I thought it was something like the animation speeds or something, but no, it's some low-level thing. And it's like, well, of course that shouldn't be there. That makes no fucking sense. It shouldn't be there. But you, at the same time, and then you think, oh, now it's so much harder to use mines. But the context of that particular mental interaction is coming from the fact you've played with the previous system for, 20 plus years at this point, where I at least have watched StarCraft a lot in the times I was with StarCraft 2. So that never left you, but that was the interaction you were stuck with. But that interaction is wrong. It's just like the whole 1 out of 256 chance to miss thing.
Yeah.
Like, I always instinctively knew, because you don't go through this game for so many years without thinking something's wrong. Yeah. But you never heard about this anywhere, so you never really quite knew what it was, is that sometimes projectiles would just not hit units. And it was just kind of weird. And a lot of the times I thought it was stuff like being under doodads or something like that was influencing the hit rates.
And it does. It contributes. That's the same thing as height. So.
Yeah, and that like that. But then I thought, but no, there's some inconsistency, but you never really knew. Like, it was something that's never told to you, which is just absolutely fucking insane. It's insane enough that it exists, and it's doubly insane that there is no way to know that it exists. Like, it just feels like an insane bug that has undoubtedly influenced professional games all across the board without anybody even realizing it. And, you get a line between what is the magic box research. I remember when that first came out, and it was all the Korean commentary and stuff like that, exposing this is how people figured out Mutalisks, and this is the ideal attack angles, and this is, the projectiles bounce more across this range or whatever. And it's like, just with the way the game is built, there's going to be imperfections in it because of its small resolution and the way things are going to be based on pixel distances and shit. But, you'd expect all that to be mopped up just without even bringing it up. It's just like, we've entered a new engine. It's time to actually fix this stuff and make all this stuff consistent. Obviously, that's not something that actually happens in reboots or remasters. They just fuck with other shit instead of actually fixing bugs. They
add chromium.
But, that's disgusting. And but then, that's like one thing. It's like, we've understood now how the game works, and this is just as a byproduct of how it functions. I've gone from, creative use of game mechanics, as it's often called, into what is very obviously, a massive bug, which is shit just sometimes misses straight up, and it's completely and entirely unpredictable. And that's the other thing you want to stay away from when you go into control, is everything has to be predictable. Now, this is where you're going to reach that argument you're mentioning, is at what stage do you cross the line between, what is something behaving precisely as you had intended it to behave? And if you start reaching into territory where we're actually taking away control. And that's definitely when we reach points of automation. Like with StarCraft 2, that's auto mining, that's auto building, that's the refineries and stuff like a lot of stuff in the campaign is really based around automation. And I don't know, like there's many different examples, like the way the mission objectives are, like even the way of like thinking of like how the maps are designed all around timers, is that's all really automation too, because all the map direction has been placed under the governance of this being this arbitrary timer. So all the resource allocation, everything being spawned on timers, no actual interaction or anything like that, it's all automated. So there's not even any interaction of you trying to control the map. You're just basically playing a glorified QuickTime event. That's why the campaigns are so fucking boring. And that is a form of automation. The game isn't necessarily playing itself, but the whole interaction structure that you're interacting with is all playing itself. That's why I go into the competitive arm of RTS. That's why you got to ignore all the existing examples of single player content, because they just don't do it right. And it's all related into just this arbitrary set of series of fixed numbers when nothing is actually really dynamic to it at all. And with controls in particular, the controls are one of the most important things, because if you start fucking up the controls, it doesn't matter what the hell you do beyond that point. It's not going to be experienced in a lens in which consistency is governing that. And once you establish consistent controls, then you start questioning a lot of other content. Like with the mines, a lot of the times you might see some discussion about killing mines and how valuable mines are stuff. There's no excuse, or rather no argument that mines can be quite dangerous. And a lot of that danger is coming from what would be a bug, though.
Right.
So you don't, once you realize that that's a bug, and then you correct that bug, it completely changes the lens from which you start viewing the mine argument. So now you think about, okay, so now mines have actually an extremely binary interaction about them, which is, are you A-moving your units? Do you actually have detection? Are you trying to bait them out like DF was in those Dracodin spam games? Are you just have Hydras, which are just really fast attackers and have hit scan in general? Are mines just maybe a little bit too binary where you either insta-gib them or they deal massive fucking damage if they contact you? So this discussion is a little less, lopsided in the previous iteration because control wasn't as useful against mines at that point because there was just this wall of RNG between you potentially killing the mine and it hitting you when you pop it up next to your units, or you being able to just get hit by it regardless of what you do at that stage. So the interaction was much more valuable on baiting it out or using observers. Now, because it's so much easier to actually just kill them straight up, it completely changes the way their power budget is actually distributed, even if you were not to change the statistics of any of those units. And it all just comes down to them being more responsive. And that just brings a discussion to light that maybe you should have always had, right? Like it just exposes the actual core interactions in a way which you're only going to get to that point when the control system is behaving consistently all across the board. And that's why I think control should be one of the things you always focus on, really first and foremost. And, with StarCraft 2, the other problem with it, of course, is that the other thing that it's not as much of an issue in StarCraft 2 as it is in Warcraft 3. Auto formations is absolute cancer. It is just pure, unfiltered cancer, end to end to end. And that's in Age of Empires too. It's actually probably like one of the number one things I hate about Age of Empires is auto formations. And what I hate about Warcraft 3, it's like, oh, I've selected a whole whack of units. Now they're all going to move as slowly as the other one. The slowest of them. And they're all going to bunch up in a strange way. And then they're going to start spinning and they're all going to bundle. In StarCraft 2, they all get super bundled up. And then, of course, you have the whole death ball thing. And it's just like, the proposed solution, quote unquote, to this that I saw, that I believe was in Starbow, is that they have an innate behavior, an effect on every unit that causes them to change their direction every, like on a random timer or something like that, to break up their movement so that they wouldn't bunch up as much. And that was like, when people start considering that to be a viable way to fight the way that the pathing is behaving, you just got to go back to the drawing board.
The thing that really gets me about the idea that you like the formation system in particular, or really anything, like in Brood War, the rules are not told to you about how the pathing system works, but basically it's like, if you click outside of the formation that you have selected, they will try to keep that formation when moving to their new destination. And if you click inside the formation, which is the magic box thing, then they will collapse the formation. And those are just two rules, and obviously the unit pathing makes it seem rather inconsistent. But the game is trying to do one of those two things, and it's always consistent depending on your inputs. The problem with formations, or with like the weird like flocking grouping behavior that StarCraft 2 has, where obviously everything collapses as a matter of course, and like actually trying to split your units is a very arduous task. And so people don't even try to do it unless they're reserving it for like reaction to indicators, aka disruptors, or banelings or something, right? And so like generally speaking, you'll see the general, like the collapse of all of the units, right? It's like the pathfinding is actually one of the main issues with that game in terms of what governs it towards death balls and all this other stuff. And they can add gimmicks and whatnot to try to like force you to move out, or they can, the Starbow guys can entertain randomness, I guess, to change that. But the thing that gets to me anyway, the thing that I look at is like, if you had to try and think about how you would resolve that, you really can't. It's sort of like the spider mine issue, where it's like, maybe it's not warranted, or maybe it never occurs to you that you have to change the spider minds because the control scheme, or like the unit control behaviors, I guess, like the actual responsivity of the units wasn't high enough, and it was just like inconsistent. And until you made it consistent, you can't really like evaluate the problem holistically. But the same thing happens with the formation system. Is like it can't really read the player's intention. It doesn't really care about the player's intention, in fact, and it's like this extra system. It's sort of like, I'm jumping around a lot here, but it's very similar to squads in that respect, where it's like there's this underlying layer of gameplay logic running for the pathfinding specifically that doesn't really care what specific thing the player wants. And the player then can only issue vague commands instead of precise commands, because the formations or the squads or whatever are going to handle all of the specific stuff, the precise stuff, if you will, but they do it in their own way, which may not be easy to understand intuitively by the player. And even if they can understand it, they may not be able to predict what inputs actually equate to what outputs. Like maybe they only understand that like the way that it's going to work. Some games try to get around this with squads by like showing you a preview of where they take cover, but that implies they have a cover system like fucking Dawn of War or whatever, and it's just like you're stacking stupid upon stupid at that point. So the thing that I always look at for that is like, can I, like a shit test for the average RTS game is can I just move my units from like point A to point B without feeling like there's something fighting me in some way, like some slight system in conflict, or in the case of squads, it's not very slight at all. It's very obvious. But those are the things that always get to me about formations and et cetera, is that it's like I don't want my units to be in that formation, like I would always prefer to disable it if it were given to me as an opportunity. And I believe in Warcraft 3, like it was a fucking, you'd have to like,
I think there is a switch in Warcraft 3.
Maybe there was, yeah.
There is some, I remember there's some switch with the formation in Warcraft 3, but I don't remember how it works too much because I haven't played anything other than fucking MOBA clones in so long, and that all I know is that when units collide in Warcraft 3, it is just like Tub Girl.
Well, they do like to sit there and sort of occasionally brush up,
spin.
Occasionally spin, it's like that scribe gateway interaction I described, but like for every unit.
It is so awkward to path in that game. Like that is StarCraft 2's pathing, just without, because it is the same engine, right, just without all the push priority and clumping and stuff. Way of describing it that I forget from years ago, but it's basically without the decolliding kind of behavior with it. And then they attack it, because when you turn that off in StarCraft 2, when you start disabling all that stuff in StarCraft 2, it is literally just Warcraft 3 under the hood. It's just they've increased the turn radius or turn rates, and it is still just as awkward, which is why it always inherently feels bad to control stuff in StarCraft 2. But I don't think anything really quite beats Dawn of War, where it was in one of the expansions where they finally added a map that had like a flat, like pretty much all the maps are just bloodbaths. They're just all really small with some like big, very large, sort of almost like Tetris-like, but very simplified walls. But there was this one map that had a almost like a pillar formation of terrain, but it was about the size of the screen. But it was one of the first maps that they really introduced this kind of terrain in. And of course, the very first thing that happens is half the squad gets stuck on one side, half the squad gets stuck on the other side. They don't know where to go. Trying to get them to move back together is just impossible, and it takes forever. And yeah, the vehicle controls in all those games was kind of awkward too.
Oh yeah,
Company Heroes had some interesting ideas in it, but the response rate for the units, it was like you would tell the unit to do something, like 5 seconds later it would start moving. So it was like impossible to ever micro stuff in those games at all.
Which is funny because obviously they're ostensibly about
yeah, they're RTTs. They're supposed to be about micro, but it's so hard to micro stuff. When it just
when the units aren't responsive,
it's sending your signal over to the International Space Station. The Chinese are decrypting it and adding it to their database. Then it gets wired over to India, where they got to type it on their typewriters to reprocess it and send it back to the developers. So okay, you can move your unit now.
Yeah, it's very silly. I had the same problem with Command and Conquer 3 because they have these systems where the vehicles themselves are supposed to have like realistic banking and stuff, so you can't just
Yeah.
like it makes sense if you're going for that. Like isn't it kind of weird that in Brood War the siege tank just starts moving and like it just snaps into another direction or whatever. I mean, obviously it has turn rate, but it's pretty quick. And there's no turning or whatever. The problem is as soon as you start using that, you realize, oh, this feels fucking horrible, and I would never want to use vehicles if that was going to be the case. And so many a case where especially when you're dealing with shitty campaign maps with pre-placed static defense everywhere. It's like I try to move my unit and he spins out into the range of a static defense structure because of his facing angle, and it's just over at that point. So yeah, I feel like the units themselves actually being responsive is it is one of the most important things about an RTS game. I mean, it's perhaps the most important thing about the actual interaction layer. Just talking about the programming systems or whatever, the mechanics of the game, it's probably the most important thing is do my units responsively answer my commands, and how responsive are they when I tell them to do a certain thing, right? And that's where the attack move versus spider mines comes into the play and stuff. And I don't know that maybe the spider mine concept, I'm open to this being the case. I don't think it is, but maybe the spider mine idea only works because if your units are stupid, basically, if your units are inconsistent.
Well, it makes them much more powerful, right? It gives you a window of opportunity to get power budget and value out of the mines, even if they walk into them knowing that they're there and they try to snipe them. There's still a chance you're going to get value out of them, which is important in TVP in particular, when the vulture itself is very useless, except for killing workers because of concussive damage, because they've backed themselves into a corner with the way that this unit's power budget is distributed.
Right.
The vast majority of it's loaded into the effectiveness of the spider mines. So anytime the spider mines actually see damage applied, it makes the unit more valuable. And that means that there's this layer of basically just RNG of a crit chance of you actually getting power budget out of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was thinking about it just now, and I feel like you could probably, in CMBW, obviously there is no concussive damage. Vultures are more useful as combatants, and there's only 2 mines per vulture instead of 3 because that's not 3. And then
not 3.
I was just thinking you could probably shift Q, because we also made the actual process of laying mines a lot more sensible, where they don't just decollide versus the vulture and stuff. You could probably shift Q 2 mine drops very close by, with one of them intending to be closer to whoever's attacking or whatever, but them being roughly in the same range. And you could imagine units focusing all of their shots onto one, especially if it's a projectile like a Dracodon, and then the second one actually proccing. So I feel like there's even still ways you can sort of adapt to that. And that's another thing, is that obviously with this mod, in this closed community, or it's not closed community, it's a tightly knit community with small group. Not a lot of us are very good, and so we haven't actually really plumbed the depths of how good you can be with this new system or with some of these new tools. And as soon as you get into a situation where there's some unit that hasn't really been used very often, you might just end up realizing, oh shit, these are really powerful or whatever. It's well, nobody tested them, right? And so that's a simple example of it, but I think the same thing is probably true where if somebody really abuses, you talked about how somebody's got really good micro and they abuse the loaded sieged phalanx, and then they just keep dropping this thing, this artillery unit.
I mean, you could even see it even with your play a couple times. Maybe it's just raw luck, but there's several times that you pick up a siege tank and 8, 10 Dracodon shots just hit nothing.
Yeah, that's intentional.
So if you figure out a way to do this consistently, it's just going to be massive.
Yeah. I mean, but again, if transport handling was a bit better, where they didn't have the stupid drifting halt distance shit, then it would probably be a lot snappier.
It'd be even stronger.
It would be stronger, but also it would be more consistent. Again, I feel because there's some times where you'll do the same order, but based on this one was 6 pixels further out, so it had to move closer or whatever. You know what I mean? There's gonna be these weird things that should it matter, and should we be testing for something as basic as that, or as seemingly inconsistent and unintuitive and weird and clunky as that? I don't know that we should. And so that's I mean, in my plans for our RTS games, we don't even plan for acceleration at all because of the fact that it does lead to these really strange, inconsistent issues. And I really think the only thing we lose, I mean, my hypothesis is the only thing we lose with acceleration being gone is air units and units that have engines and thrusters or whatever just suddenly start moving at full speed, and maybe it looks a bit jarring. But I don't know. I feel like, you know, maybe it's possible to make it so that it just happens fairly quickly instead of it being completely removed. But I don't know that it's necessary as like an ingredient or whatever for an RTS game. I feel like you know, especially considering what you have to deal with when it is added, when it is a part of your game. And that's another thing that's obviously very heavily related to how the unit handles, right? Unit handling, unit control is like, well, if my Panoptises run into infantry because of some weird thing, probably user error, to be honest, but we'll pretend the Shambler was true when he was saying all that stuff. And you know, okay, like, yeah, that's what you get. Like, there's a potential for that to exist in the game if you have acceleration in the game. And I'm really not sure. Like, obviously, one of the reasons why we didn't remove it, by the way, is we tested with removing it from everything, and ground units would start like glitching into terrain a lot because LOL Brood War. But beyond that, obviously, if you tried to remove it from workers, assuming there were no like collision bugs, the mining would be very heavily affected, right? And so that would like completely throw off a lot of shit related to that. So that's like, okay, I'm not gonna worry about that. Right, but maybe we just remove it from air units and see how it is. I don't know. Like, I just kind of think about it like it's just this extra system that is obviously inconsistent with other units. Like, I would kind of suspect that units would either all have acceleration or none of them would. But obviously, some units just move statically, like the Maverick or whatever, the Zealot and stuff. And then other units actually move with this weird gradation. And so, yeah, who knows? Like, at the end of the day, I'm sure we'll find some superior solution. But I kind of look at it similar to the whole Spider-Mine interaction of like, you know, is it really like maybe this thing does get a lot more powerful or a lot less powerful because we take this control system or this unit handling trait and we like make it more consistent and more like easy to use or in some capacity, right? Like, it's obviously easier to clear mines now because you just attack move, but that just means that you have to change how you engage with mines. Like, that's how you have to change how you lay them or like how you play around them or whatever. And I mean, I think I've also noticed a lot of people stopped A moving recently. I don't know what's happening there, but they're actually regular moving now, which is really funny because then they just goes back to pre CMBW state. But the thing, so like I just look at that and I'm like, okay, you know, there's this unintuitive, clunky system of acceleration. And it's kind of like having randomness on your unit's timer for like attacking or whatever, which wasn't, I don't know that it was random, but it was definitely, well, I guess there were some cases where it was random because they didn't want all units to attack at the same time. So they like offset it by like 1 or 2 frames or whatever, up to 7 frames, I believe, which is actually not nothing, right? That's a lot
for a 24 FPS game.
So you can imagine that would be that would make things very weird. And so I'm sure there's still some such timers in the game that we should look for. But the main thing that I look at there is like, how can we make unit control, again, like the question at the beginning, right, is like, how do we make unit control as responsive as it should be? And we define should by like not making it really trivial where the unit automates its own actions or whatever, its optimal play. And I think like maybe the answer to a lot of that is by making sure that like positional gameplay is really important still. And I think that is never going to go away just because of the way that we're designing the tech trees and whatnot. Because like being intelligent with your positioning is something that you can't really automate. Like, you might get lucky and like already have your units in a pretty solid initial formation, and then like you order an attack move or they just like get attacked, you know, and you were like prepared for that, right? And then you don't have to do much micro adjustments on the fly during the fight because you already kind of did the setup. But that's still like, that's already feeding into the positional gameplay anyway. And then on the positional side elsewhere, it's like, what else can we do for, you know, what can we make sure to avoid? Like, we obviously don't want units to push themselves out of the way because that actually, like, you brought that up, and in some ways it does make the game easier, but I actually feel like it's also a noob trap, right? In some ways, because you could just move your units out of position.
Weird shit.
It's just another system.
Because you can just shove units in really weird ways you didn't want to.
So that's another thing I would worry about. So, yeah, I mean,
like that's the issue about automation. Is the game automating something? That isn't necessarily something the player wants to happen.
Right. Well, you know what? I used to always bring up worker like wandering as an automation system that makes sense or whatever, but actually it doesn't make sense anymore. It's like yet another thing that hits the cutting room floor. Like, especially when we have mineral nodes and whatnot that have different yields, I actually don't want my workers to spin out. I want them to try to wait patiently to mine the thing that I told them to mine. And that's another thing where it's like, you know, if we removed worker wandering, I feel like we would probably be able to add that contextual smart rally thing where it just like tells the worker to mine, because you would still have to change your rally point anyway, which would be your sort of like, it would obviously be less APM, but it would be also less of a chore. And like I basically agree with the idea that like your workers being idle while you're doing that is a chore, but like that's not something that we can easily remove in Brood War due to the rest of the system being kind of jank and having this like wandering automation behavior that I actually don't want in the game. Like as a player, when I tell my worker to like wait in line to mine a high yield mineral and it's next to a lower yield mineral, and then he's like, oh, I have to wander because I have to like change target because that one's busy. It's like, okay, well now I have to like babysit him more, and it's actually more of a chore. And so in some ways my APM, if I'm really wanting to optimize my mining, in some ways it's actually higher APM, more of a chore than before.
Yeah, I kind of ran into that too. It was something I ran into. I think it was actually in one of the 2v2 games. Right. It suddenly dawned on me where the wandering thing you were talking about before came from, and I was like, oh, it's because you've changed all the yields. And I'll watch the workers drift from an 8 to a 2 yield, and I'll be like, yeah, that's going to cause you to have a huge APM sink for this, at least until you're full saturation.
Yeah, so you can imagine, like, you know, for most nodes, you only need 2 workers. So you imagine just like, you know, you rally 1 worker to each node that's high yield, and then probably like, you do like 8 and then 6, because those are the initial ones. And then you probably double saturate the 8, and then maybe you do 4 and double saturate the 6, or whatever the formula we discovered that's like pretty good. But like that would still involve you managing your rally at the very least. And actually, if you miss rally, this is another thing, is like there's so many issues that like inflate certain things or like make, for example, like I was really reticent to buff Cyprian damage. I did recently do that slightly, but I was really reticent to do that for a long time because obviously a lot of their utility is the AoE shit. But if you think about it, it's like the only thing AoE is good for when it's small is killing stacks of workers and stacks of air units. And it's like, if workers and air units just have fucking collision instead of what they have, then like suddenly I can actually make AoE much more interesting, or I can make it so that like because the Cyprian is supposed to use twin railguns, maybe it would just...
I feel targeted by all these nerfs and buffs.
Don't worry, it wasn't...
Nerfing Panoptises, buffing Cyprians? Or what are you trying to say here?
Well, the Cyprian thing is just because they had like 50 life or whatever. So they were just like... The problem that Terran has is that they just die.
They're slow as fuck, so...
So they generally...
They're really only that good in bunkers.
We're slowly trying to rectify the fact that Terran has to be married to bunkers for like 20 minutes in every match, but that's its own, that could be its own podcast, actually. That's its own saga. But yeah, like the way that it works, that it's working out anyway, is the idea that like, how do we like there's so many things, like AoE is one example. Like you can do more interesting and I would say more correct designs.
Well, the AoE thing, this very specific interaction brings me to the shit that we had to deal with Ricky trying to balance maps. And well, it was his Warlords and Merchants map, which, to briefly summarize, you have 2 sets of players. You have the Warlords, which are basically in an FFA, and you have the Merchants that make units and shit that they can buy. He had one in Warcraft 3, he had one in StarCraft 2. In both editions of the map, because it always turns into people making air units, What he does is he makes all fucking defense deal AoE damage.
Okay, I see.
So all you had to do to deal with air units is just build defense, static defense. And what do you know? Most of the time, it would just insta-give air units. You don't have enough damage, just build more towers. So now the air units would go into your base, and because they would, especially in StarCraft 2, where they would always bunch up real nice and tight, they would just get fucking instantly. You see like 60, 70 Void Rays just evaporate instantly. And like, it was just, for one, it was lazy as fuck. For two, it really highlighted the whole issue of the fact that these defenses were only useful when they could do shit like this.
Yes.
Otherwise, they just weren't that good, because you'd have to buff them and doing like insane damage otherwise. Because otherwise, there was so much power budget worth of damage coming out of the air units in the stacks that they could just sit in one spot and just insta-give anything else, especially Void Rays, could just instantly kill everything that came nearby them. And this, of course, was a problem in Melee StarCraft 2 as well, that you had to have huge stacks of AoE to be able to compete with that. And that all comes down to the fact that they would cluster so much. And then that's when you had the AoE, its value would just exponentially increase when this happened. And it was just, the whole interaction was just dumb. But particularly with StarCraft 2, I was always frustrated by the stacking of air units a lot. And no matter what you tried to do, you can't get them to not stack to each other. 'Cause especially since I was going to have these big ships.
Right.
And then I would have small fighters. And it's like, you can't even see the fucking fighters to begin with, because the way 3D is, it's not like they layer on top of each other and you might see the Wraiths or the Battlecruiser. There's not a hope in hell that in StarCraft 2 unless you start giving everything different elevation rates. And that's just going to make the already insane problems with readability and 3D in that game even worse. There was really no winning about it. And that was really one of the core factors that really kept me from like getting into my projects that much, is because when I started actually developing prototype tech trees and going into late games with the AI, and you started seeing air units, it was just absolutely fucking incomprehensible. And then balancing it with the AoE and shit on top of it was annoying. So I think it'd be really interesting to see a world where you enter a case where you can actually give air units real collision.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, air units and workers having collision means, obviously it changes a lot of other interactions, but it specifically means that AoE doesn't have to be this like, oh, I just add AoE to this one unit and suddenly it's like potentially infinitely more cost efficient against air, right? Because you can attack potentially infinitely numbers of units, right? It's like, that's kind of meant to be reserved for very specific units. Like the Madrigal doesn't have a target cap when it's in its tempo up mode. And it's like, okay, that's an interesting quirk, but like technically every AoE unit also qualifies when they're fighting, air or workers or whatever, anything that stacks. And that's just silly to me. It's like, I think once again, it's like an example of, air units, okay, they ignore terrain, but like, do they also have to ignore collision with themselves and etc.? Like my concept was different elevation levels will collide with each other. And so fighters will collide with each other, but capital ships won't. And maybe we'll have to change it so that all air units collide with each other. But the idea behind that system is so that you can actually have classes of unit, right? Where it's like if the flagships are further closer to the ground, then the air units sort above them or whatever. I was actually thinking it would be the opposite, but obviously then you do have issues where you might be able to hide fighters underneath stuff. I don't know that it would be really significant because, again, the fighters themselves do still collide with each other, so maybe you'd be able to hide like one or two, depending on, maybe a lot more depending on the size of things, right? But like, these are all ideas that we have, right? It's like we have different sort of like tiers or different planes of movement, and they all give you different things as a result, and so you end up having those different elevation levels which collide with each other, and you don't have to worry about like suddenly AoE is just going to hard counter my entire composition. It actually opens up more fair power budgeting for both the AoE units and the air units, because now you don't have to worry about either one of those interactions. Because like there's obviously a case where if you're up against a comp that doesn't have AoE, well, suddenly my stack of air units like mutas or whatever are just going to tear through this shit really easily. And that's what you see in like TVZ all this time. And like that's why like Valkyrie builds are now a lot more popular in mainstream Brood War. And it's like, okay, well, that gives you the opportunity to respond because you have AoE. But really, if they didn't clump up, if they didn't stack, like there would be opportunity for you to respond with more conventional arms. Now, obviously, like if you just make that one change, it's just like anything else. If you just make this one very large sweeping systemic change that is obviously going to touch many other interactions,
will suddenly be useless.
There's going to be loads of cases where stuff like that happens, right? And the same is true for like if you remove the selection limit in default StarCraft, then like obviously things that you can just like mass up and then attack move without too much worry, especially Protoss units. Those things are just going to get a lot more powerful because a lot of their power budget is expressed even if they're just moving kind of lazily. And so you don't have to worry then about like multiple control groups and handling them and all that. It's like that's actually one of the things that balances them, even though people probably don't recognize it because it's just ingrained into them that there's only 12 units, by the way. So you can only select that many. And it's like I look at that and I think like, this is we've talked about this quite a bit too, but it's like, maybe a failure to recognize what the actual influences are. And like people are just sort of in the dark about, again, like, cargo cult kind of ethos, right? People just don't understand what makes Brood War what it is. And and I'm sure this is true of myself in some ways too, right? It's like, I don't know all of the reasons why certain things work or don't work. And I have to kind of explore them, but it doesn't feel like anybody else is, right? Like, I think the only RTSs that I'm aware of that have like big RTSs, I should know. I'm sure there's a bunch of like niche ones and whatnot, maybe ones I've even played. But the mainstream RTS games that I've played, I think Age of Empires has workers that don't collide with each other, but they also have this weird repulsion system where like instead of actually decolliding, or like instead of pathing around themselves, they just kind of move in a blob and then they sort of like constantly jitter out is what I was told. So
the Smash convention effect?
I guess. I would have to take a closer look at it, admittedly, but obviously those units don't collide with each other. And so like they are workers, right? And so like they're pretty thin, like they're pretty small. So that probably helps with that. Whereas like we were thinking about,
I haven't been working very much.
Yeah, apparently. The thing that gets me though is that like not really that many people want to explore like, Age of Empires is like really tiny in terms of the kinds of things you can make in its tech tree, right? It's like technically you can scale up quite heavily in technology, but it doesn't really feel like it. And it's also very like, a lot of races or civilizations or whatever factions are all the same. They just have like 3 or 4 unique things about them or whatever. Like, I guess maybe they may have made it more polarized in the later installments or something, but for the most part it's like there's a lot of overlap between the different factions, and then they obviously advertise that they have like 20 factions, and it's like I don't know if that's that word means what you think it means, bro. But all of the available ideas is like I look at what we have in CMBW alone, and it's like it would be so much better because like for the Cyprian example, I would just make it go to max range and fire a projectile that pierces stuff. And then, okay, it's like AoE, and now it's suddenly a lot more positional dependent, right? And maybe I'll do that anyway, because technically it would still work on air units, but like that's like more interesting of a design, and it's afforded primarily, like I don't have to worry about, it's not going to work as well against stacks of air units that'll just, kill it because of the situation. Like, you know what I mean? Like I don't have to worry that like, these things that exist outside of normal pathfinding conventions, suddenly make it invalid. And I feel like that's probably the biggest issue is like when you go through this and you try to like rope these inconsistent things into a more consistent outlook. Like I'm aware there's a way where if you really try to make a lot of systems all adhere to like similar principles, you could get to a point where you're over governing things and you might sap all of the variety. Like, I was thinking about this with the Zerg tech tree some months ago. And for a while, it's like Vorvercores were tier 2. You had to like get the Quasrock Pool mutation to unlock them. And then I was like, well, what if they're tier 1 and we sort of break convention in that aspect? And I feel like that works out pretty well, even though it's not consistent as a system. And the reason why I don't really care that it's not consistent is because like the output is pretty good and it's still consistent with enough other systems. Like this unit morphs into another unit and, like all these other things, right? It still has its place sort of etched out in terms of like design real estate by the rest of the systems of the tech tree that we're trying to impart. And then, like, yes, there's some asymmetry or what have you, but the fact that you get a number of situations where you can use that, like that inconsistency, if you want to call it that. The fact that you get to use it to like augment your army with, it's like pretty pricey in terms of it being, the price of another 2 Zethar cores just to get 1 Vorver core. It's like, it's not nothing, right? And so it's not like it's affording you an undue amount of real estate as the player. Like, it's not like, oh, this is just a really overpowered strategy, right? It's like, no, this is just another thing that you can do. And the fact that it's at tier 1 instead of tier 2 is just like, it's the only case where that's the case, right? Nothing else is like that, but I still feel like it builds upon the rest of the systems enough that I don't have to worry about it as much. So that's like a very specific example. And I'm not sure how I feel about the like corollaries in other cases, but as far as those things go, I think that was like a very positive change in aggregate, because otherwise like Vorver cores would just never be used usually. I mean, you could still use them at tier 2 now, but like back in the day, when they were tier 2, specifically, you didn't really build Zethar cores at all, let alone Vorver cores, and it didn't really make that much sense for you to worry about them. And so when I think about it in those terms, it's like, yeah, it probably makes a lot more sense to leave them as they are, and that does unlock a little bit more like strategic diversity, and also gives you this feel. I mean, maybe this is overrated as well, but I feel like there's a feeling where if the like, you get this in really good puzzle games, of which there are very few in my experience. But like, if you feel like you understand the pattern or whatever, like you recognize that there is a pattern, and then suddenly you're like, oh well, the rules, like the rules that I thought of in the past can't apply to this as the solution. So the rules must be deeper than I imagined, or there must be something that I didn't actually recognize yet. And I feel like discovering that is kind of interesting, and that still applies to a tech tree as well, where like there is a pattern, it is consistent, but it's not just like every structure unlocks 3 units and every structure morphs into another structure, which then unlocks 3 units from those units. It's like, well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not really about the exact number, or you don't even need the evolved structure in some cases, and it's more like, evolution is the controlling theme, or what have you, and mutation is the controlling theme. So I'm aware that you can get to a point where you're over legislating a lot of systems in the name of consistency, and as a result you actually like remove some critical variety, or some critical diversity, I guess. There's a good word. And you get to a point where maybe it's just a little bit too, it's like, maybe over-designed isn't the right word, but like that's sort of the vibe that I get. I don't know if you've had similar experiences yourself when you're trying to lay out like tech trees or something similar.
To be fair, tech trees are usually quite later in the project for me, actually. But I have had a fairly similar experience with Apex X in recent times, actually. I'm trying to recall, I'm too tired, and it was a long time ago, that I discussed some of the updates to the movement, the control, and then the stagger systems and stuff like that I was working. I actually don't know if I talked too much about the stagger. I probably at least introduced it. But after introducing those systems and going back and forth on ideas, and then I made that discussion video that I don't know you may have seen, with the in discussion to stagger and talking about some of the sources I have and just kind of bringing up ideas and stuff. One of the things I had thought about is that currently with the way the system is that each attack type has its own kind of properties, and those properties are both the behavior, for example, the root motion associated with them, how much AoE they have, but also the statistical attributes. And the way I had balanced this out when I had begun and all the way up to present day is that I budgeted things based on reliability, standard damage, stagger damage, how much motion applies to you, what options open up based on what abilities. So, for example, presently, it's not intended, but presently, thrust has no Ragnarok component to it. So you can't fork out of thrust to deal high damage with anything. And base attack has the highest overall DPS because it has the highest base damage and it animates the fastest, but it doesn't move you very far. Advancing attack is fairly high damage, but not too much stagger. And it does have a Ragnarok option available on the second attack, which can come up quite quickly. So, and then you had some outliers that kind of broke conventions. Like, the Ragnarok was a high damage attack that you currently cannot combo out of. It's something that is like a finisher, and it tends to do high damage. And conventionally, that's available only at the end of certain combos, or partway through those combos, and then they break the combo. But then I added in the Evasion Ragnarok, which you can use it directly out of dash, and is quite useful for jousting. And now you have a high damage option right away that behaves completely different than everything else in the game. So that broke some conventions. And then, in part due to the stagger changes, and in part due to the way that I didn't like the way that I was thinking things through mentally, where I felt like I was obligated to play certain ways to approach certain things, is Thrust was the narrow attack that had the highest stagger damage potential. And stagger became infinitely more valuable when units could no longer be permanently staggered, because before, once you hit something into stagger, no matter what attack you had, it would continue to stun them so long as you hit them. So you would just try to opt for the highest damage based on your positioning and any other threats that were around you. For example, if you wanted to continue to move, you could just circle strafe around them with advancing strike. If you just wanted raw damage, you would go for a base attack and stay in place. But in order to reach those points, you still had to stagger them. Now, with units being able to recover their stagger after having animated, you now relied even more on dealing stagger damage, which meant you became even more biased to using Thrust a lot. And that meant just using mobility to get yourself in a position where you can use Thrust. So, under certain circumstances, you might be inclined to do a couple things to approach this. You might, for example, just reduce the stagger on stuff, or just make your other abilities deal more stagger damage, or some other such things. What I actually end up doing is I remove probably half or more of the stagger damage that Thrust attack does, and then I made it a little faster to animate. So I also added in more stagger damage to some other attacks. Actually, there's a lot of changes, and I'm hoping I can do a quick demo at some point here to show those. But what I kind of started leaning towards is that I wanted access to both kinds of damage pretty much homogenous throughout stuff, just more or less balanced around the attack speed and then how risky it was to use it. Thrust being so narrow and having not too much mobility is always going to be inherently more risky to use. So I ended up giving it higher base damage, standard damage, and left its final attacks to have fairly high stagger. And the way I started to view things was, I had all these conventions initially where I was budgeting stuff in a way in which I wanted each ability to have unique attribute to it in terms of how much damage it was dealing. But after having discussions with you and Swedishman and HKS in regards to control systems and going through the discussion, reflecting everything and otherwise distancing from the project for a time and then coming back to it, I started to realize that at the end of the day, the numbers to me really didn't make too much of a difference when I was playing. It was all about the actual interactions. And the interaction concepts have always been the most important things. And the reason why I was tending to stuff is because it gave me control. Staggering things gives you control. Right. And I was always going for that because it gave me control. So just to have consistent damage coming out of everything meant that then I could emphasize more on just the way that they behaved and felt to play, rather than feeling like I needed to do something because it was more optimal. So I ended up breaking all the conventions I had just in terms of the damage types and the amount of damage this stuff was doing, starting to pursue control. And there's been a lot of just little changes here and there and little tweaks here and there, and then some very, very, very massive fundamental changes to the way the control system has actually been structured. I reintroduced dash canceling, and then I removed dash canceling, at least temporarily, because I introduced something that I call movement canceling, which is just, well, that's something that really could use a demonstration. I don't know if you wanted to continue on this other topic or jump into this.
Well, it's up to you. I mean, if you have more to say on the existing topic that you were working on, which was talking about how like the numbers and breaking conventions and whatnot, we can continue on that, or if you feel like you said your piece, we can switch over.
Well, I'm going to. That's something I can demonstrate too. So, this is, of course, going to assume that most people have watched at least one of our videos for this. But let me.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. I don't, at the risk of starting another complete topic, and I don't know how much you really want to get into this anyway, but I was really surprised when I was watching some of the videos that you had posted that I was actually the only person who played it to completion. I don't know if that's changed since you've recorded that.
Well, I had a long discussion with HKS about that because he actually was going through a lot of stuff in his real life at that time, and he had not actually been aware I had sent him a newer version. But as far as the first voyage is concerned, yes, you are the only person to go through the first voyage to completion at all. So, in fact, other than the prior build that HKS went through all the way up until Schwa before the door bugged out and bumped him out and he couldn't get in, nobody else has even gone past the halfway point.
Okay, that's pretty wild to me because, I mean, it's, well, I don't know. Like you said, maybe like people had a lot of shit going on in their personal lives around the time or whatever, but I kind of look at it like, you know, just purely because I know you, from the, you know, stuff that I followed and the stuff that you're doing, it's like you can't really come into Apex X with the idea that it's going to be like any other game, especially any other game that's like an action game or an ARPG style game, or, you know, something in the vein of Dark Souls or God of War. And I mean, obviously the thing I told you that I most appreciated about it was definitely the fact that I could just jump anywhere that I see, and like the exploration part I thought was really cool. And that stuff is like, I'm definitely more interested in, like, I'm very interested in the approach of exploring all of that stuff, is like how can you take this like nonlinear 3D level design stuff and then really push it into an avenue where it makes it very clear and very obvious that the rest of the industry is not doing a very good job of it all, because like it's just so refreshing to see like, oh, there's this like second level to this building and there's a bunch of rubble on the bottom level, and I could just climb on. I think it was like the first thing I did in Arbiter is like I climbed on the rubble into the second level, and I was like, yeah, that's okay, I can do that. Like that was shocking to me that it was possible, yet it's such a simple thing ultimately, right? And so like that was definitely really rewarding. And so just based on the fact that I knew it was going to be very different than anything, and then I immediately had that supposition, if you will, confirmed as soon as I started the main level. That was obviously going to suck me in, so to speak. I'm kind of surprised that people weren't able to get past the first half. I don't know if it was like a skill thing or if it was just them were they getting owned? Do you know? Was there much of a reason provided?
Let's see. So it's a combination of factors. For one, I think it was skill, for sure, because people come into this with very, very different skill sets, and the control system was a lot for them to take in, or they didn't like it. I think with the changes we have in now, it will accommodate most of that. I think in the case of roller skates, it was also that his computer couldn't really handle it, but I don't really know the full extent of that story.
Okay.
One person hasn't even run it at all, so your guess is as good as mine on that. And yeah, I don't know. Is the stream working for you right now?
We're on.
Okay, so just making sure the video is actually connected right now, because I know that was an issue in one of our recordings where you didn't get any video from it. But no, it's the control system is very well. Before it was very inconsistent. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about, actually.
Yeah, I guess briefly as a player, I can mention that I was a little surprised that the control system was very committal, I guess would be a way to describe it, where there wasn't really any canceling or any sort of like way you could escape a movement that you had already started. And I kind of like, I was kind of neutral on, obviously I haven't played a crazy number of these games. Like the last one that I played was probably that Star Wars game you watched the stream of briefly. And
oh my goodness.
You know, and player movement, I mean, like in that game, there's like a lot of attacks that lead you. There's a lot of like, you know, root motion and stuff. And also there's like lock on, and there's all this stuff that's like, you know, if you've played any of these games, you've played them all in that respect, where you kind of know that those systems exist and that those are like, cookie cutter solution to making sure the player can attack the thing because they're like designing for controllers in mind or something. Although even with controllers, I feel like you'd be able to be precise enough, but that's a separate topic. The fact that you go through and like you dispense with most of that cruft and then you just get straight to like, here's the gameplay. Like when the control scheme was then more committal, I kind of just took that as, okay, that's a decision, right? Like, and now I have to kind of think about like, what does that mean? It's similar to the whole spider mine conversation where it's like, oh, okay, now mines get popped much more easily on a move. If we assume that is an intentional decision, or at the very least, like it was discovered and then we kept with it, and so there's intention behind the fact that we didn't change it. Okay, what does that mean for like the interaction? How can I play around that? So I didn't really think of it as like super negative. I remember I probably did say that like, oh, I was expecting it to be snappier or something. But at the end of the day, if you had decided to keep with that, I wouldn't have really had many things to say on it. It's just more like, this is the way that it like influences actions. And it sounds like your new solution is a little bit more designed with the idea that you can be a little bit more free form, right? And so I suppose that's what you're going to demonstrate to us now.
So so there's still a massive amount to do. I haven't really been able to work on this too much since we shipped. But there's a few things I did want to. I probably mentioned to some extent in the past, but now I have a much more demonstrable example of a lot of that in hand now. So part of the problem with the committed attacks is that the animations I'm using are coming from all kinds of different sources. And some of them are short animations, like the base attack was always kind of short. And then those animations don't last very long, and then they end, and then you can move again. Now, what's stopping you from moving explicitly is something called root motion, where the animation has data associated with its control over the bones, and while that is active, you cannot move. And that has advantages, it has drawbacks. The advantages is small and precise movements or movements that you want to have synced to the animations are great. But if you want to give the player control over stuff, then things get a little bit more awkward. I think, to some extent, it's kind of possible. Well, in this case, for example, I have it set so that you can turn in the direction of your attack that did not exist until very shortly before the first voyage. So it was much more committal before we shipped. Right. If you did have wrong orientation, you were going to get fucked. And that was the same case for your entire combo. You couldn't reorient during your combo whatsoever. So in all my early videos, and indeed for the way most of the units were balanced, all the way up until like the sadistic weed, the malicious weed, the void hound, the dogs, the Templar, everything all the way up until like Schwab was built with that system in mind. So this project was actually far more dangerous and lethal and very, very precise. But then we had dash canceling, where if you fucked up, you could dash out of it. Now, this brings us to our discussions about spider mines, and the other stuff is very, very similar. Entirely different genres, but very similar, where we ask questions like, should this exist? Because it gives you more control. And that was one of the questions I approached with that discussion. And even though I spent 2 hours with very condensed discussion approaching this from different angles, I still didn't really have an answer to that. I still don't really have an answer to that, because most people have told me they don't think that canceling should need to exist. And I agree with that mindset that canceling shouldn't need to exist. Now, aside from that is that I face the issue where I can't make my own animations. There's all these other limitations to the resources I have available. But I had this problem where we had these fast attacks, and then we had these really, really slow attacks. And I liked that the slow attacks gave you a longer window for the combo, where you can even see me in my demonstration using that to wait to see if Schwa's going to attack, and then commit to the longer Ragnarok animation or dash out. And, I like to have that flexibility. And it didn't matter to me too much if it was different per animation, because I just kind of saw that as the quirks of the animations. I can balance the attacks accordingly. But there was the added caveat that you were locked in this animation for so much longer, and you couldn't move. You couldn't move while this was happening. So this made especially the advancing attack, but some of the other animations feel very committed. So as a stopgap at the time, I had it so that when you entered a combo window, you could dash. So you could attack and then dash out. But this was an interaction basically nobody was really familiar with or especially trained for. Now, when I shipped this, dashing was still based on your character orientation. And I believe that we had a demonstration a little while ago where I showed you that dash was now based on your camera.
Right. And you even changed it recently, I believe, to default backwards instead of forwards?
Yes, so now it defaults backwards. Before it was forwards. I'm not sure why I did that, to be fair with you. Probably just one of those things I didn't really think about, just plugged it in for the sake of the time. I never thought to change it. Very recently, I was like, HCast mentioned having a disengage. But we haven't disengaged, we have dash. And I looked at dash and I was like, but when you push dash without any directional input, it sends you forward. That's not really very helpful. So, yes, that was just like one of those little quality of life things that I decided to do. But the whole interaction of you using dash to cancel these longer animations was kind of, maybe you didn't want to dash. Maybe you were in a tighter location. Maybe there was things beside you or whatever. And, it just was like, it was something I'd always been consciously aware of, but I had always played around because I built the system. I grew up with it from the times where all attacks were moving attacks because they were all blended based on the original Worgen animations when I was refactoring those way back, all the way up to the system we built with the Kitsune, which was far more restrictive than this, where there was no such thing as camera facing anything. Everything was slave to the direction you were facing, and I could play that. But I feel like if I shipped with that in the first voyage, all of you would have had a hell of a time. That's when the difficulty of the project was actually very high. And when I started introducing more mobile enemies like the wolves that had the state reading, that's when I said, this is actually probably going to be really difficult. But then we brought in the camera facing stuff for this, and that completely trivialized a lot. But at the same time, it was something that when you bring it in, it kind of just makes sense because it's a camera-driven movement system. So I wanted it to be a camera-driven attack system. And then after that, we did the same for the dash too. But there was still the awkward thing where you had to use dash to get out of these. And then that was, in most games, it's like that. You gotta wait for your animations to finish before you get out of it. But the way I viewed it is the only thing that should really prevent you from moving is the actual active damage collision and maybe a little bit of distance after that. But I didn't know how to give you back control, but I figured it out. So what happens now is it's not perfect because of the way that the movement is being tracked right now is not perfect. When I eventually do an update to bring us onto the enhanced movement system, movement input, that will be faster and a little more reliable. Right now, if you're dancing between the inputs on your dash, if you put two in at once, I'm going to hit forward and dash, it won't always go through. And that's just because the way I have it set up that it's tracking right now is very silly. So it's not perfect. But I've worked out most of the issues for it. So right now, if you have an input held down, or you push an input, it will drop you out of the animation pretty much almost immediately after the attack part is done. So that brings us into consistency with every single animation now. Also, this may be a little too subtle to know now, but many animations have been sped up very, very considerably. Dash is also faster now. And there are some more moves as well. And there's still some tweaking to do for making it's not really as responsive as I wanted it to be on the dash. Maybe the combo window should be a little bit longer on it. But there is quite a lot that I've done to just speed things up. So when we were talking about control and changing the numbers and the stuff like that, there was something that I really wanted to get into before I started thinking about adding in new units or really changing the existing units too much. I have done some tweaks to the existing units. What I did is I hunted down every instance where I had delays on their attack still, and I removed all of them.
Okay.
So in general, they should be a little bit more responsive now. So everybody had problems with these guys. I was really surprised to learn every single player had issues with these guys. They had issues knowing when they were attacking, and I did reduce their active damage window a little bit.
I wonder if the reason is because of the silhouette or something to that effect, where there's a lot going on with it. But I don't know. I feel like
their attack is really telegraphed, right?
I learned
they have a big windup to it usually. Yeah.
And also, I think
I'm not really sure.
Tendrils or whatever those things are, their antenna are like they spaz out quite a bit when there's charge up of an attack, right? And I think that's like a read that maybe it was just harder to read in Arbiter in some of the areas you would find them in, but I mean, like you mentioned earlier, light as a resource and stuff. Like, I remember saying that it felt like things were too dark. I think we've talked about this before on this podcast. But
I've actually darkened it a little bit in night, but there was another value I changed that I think will help the darkest areas.
Yeah,
be brighter.
To me,
I haven't tested
like
it,
I looked at it like, oh. Because I just assumed it was unintentional that it was so dark. And as soon as you told me that it was intentional and you were thinking about it as light as a resource, I was like, oh, okay, well, now it makes total sense. So I didn't even really have like that much of an issue with the idea that there would be concerns with that. So it looks like you've done some work on this guy, though. He's throwing knives a little bit differently.
Yeah, so he's just had a few little fixes into him. Nothing really major yet. But I fixed his facing you when he's attacking and stuff like that now. So obviously this guy's still really, really, really early in, and I didn't do anything to fix really his most major shit. This is actually the boss version. I forgot I put the boss version and not the soldier version in here. So this one is disgustingly tanky. But there's a lot of little changes I wanted to do. Like with him, he has a whole slew of abilities planned, where he's going to have stuff moving around the level. He's going to summon swords. He's going to have timed damage. He's going to have these spinning shurikens that fly around. And he has these daggers he throws at you that will come out in... Initially, he's only going to throw just one or two. And then he'll be throwing larger waves like this as time goes on. He can actually cancel out of a dash into a dash, which is kind of funny. And I haven't accounted for that yet. But there's a lot of under-the-hood changes to this right now that... I kind of glazed over that, like the projectile revision that I mentioned in the discussions, that's done now. So the projectiles behave a bit more consistently. I haven't gone through updating all of them at this point. But another change I've done that we didn't have before is projectiles before could only do transformable or standard and stagger damage, which is a really strange decision I made when I structured their stuff. And so I fixed that. So that means that there is very possibly going to be a huge shift in the way that I approach how the player does handle this kind of stuff. Before, when I first was building this, I wanted it to be that the player and the enemy units behaved exactly the same with stagger.
Right.
Because that consistency was really important to me. That was a convention I wanted to establish. The problem with that was that it became increasingly abundant that you being staggered was always going to be something treated differently than you staggering an enemy, especially when you had large numbers of units. And
there's only one of you, and there's, potentially hundreds of enemies, right? So
it's always going to be worse for you being staggered than it is for you to have an enemy staggered or be unable to stagger an enemy. It's always going to be, a really, really big difference. So there's a lot of considerations I haven't really even attempted to getting into them yet. But I think in general that stagger is just going to be something that's going to be a lot more active. So presently, when you get hit by a stagger, you could see when he was throwing his daggers at me that the stagger recharge is faster right now. It went from 5 to 3, I think, on the initial delay. And then I think the tick rate is also a little faster. But it's possible we're going to see more segregation in ways that stagger is handled. For example, coming out of the danger zone might be faster, and the window for you being staggered might be lower, so that you do not get permanently staggered a lot but you're going to see enemies dealing more stagger damage in general. For example, his daggers were dealing stagger damage on top of transformable damage. So before it was that he just did one. So you could kind of just ignore them. And it took kind of a long time to get chipped down. It's the same case with the Pinshies. Also have those ranged daggers whose most dangerous component was the fact they could detonate the bombs when they hit them. So you really didn't have to get care about being grazed by them. But I jacked up their actual stagger damage on them. So they'll still only do 1 damage, but if they hit you, their stagger shred will be a lot higher. And they all will still only deal damage when you get dropped down to 0 stagger. So this... one of these changes were with the way the control is that I didn't like it that you could infinitely stun enemies. I didn't like it that enemies could infinitely stun you. And it became more apparent that those systems had to change when we started actually adding in different kinds of enemies. Because the way that these systems were expressing their power was obviously way too overwhelming. And, you know, then you reach a point where you have to kind of like rethink how you want the interaction with these systems to actually be. Well, I want you to be punished when you stand inside death clouds or enemies repeatedly hit you. But I don't want you to be punished so hard to the point that you feel inclined again to do one thing. Like, it brings us back to the binary interaction of things like the air units stacking on top of defenses. You don't want to have to feel compelled to introduce something because the way that something else is behaving is so overwhelmingly overbearing that it's crowding out all the other options available. Like, if stacking air units is so ridiculously strong that you have to introduce AoE,
right?
Why are they feeling compelled? Why is it that stacking air units is so ridiculously strong? Well, it's because they can put so much damage into one spot, so they're going to go for that. So then the gut reflex is always to either nerf the shit out of something because it's too strong or introduce a counter to it, right? And that just brings us to just complete horseshit interactions where you have a whole bunch of things that exist because something else exists as opposed to dialing back and fixing it. So that's kind of like the challenges we've been facing with that Dota clone, that TGS Warcraft 3 map I've posted a few cast overs for, is the initial approach to balance in that map is something is unbalanced and broken. So we need something to counter it. So, for example, we had people using Divine Shield to smash down buildings in the base because Divine Shield lasted for nearly a minute.
I can't believe that wasn't immediately changed, by the way. Like, how the fuck do you go through it? How does anybody go into Warcraft 3 and the first thing they change is not Divine Shield? Like, it's so
I don't know. Like, the original author for the map, I think, was just, like, smoking some crazy mountain dank kush or something like that. Holy shit. But, like, there's tons of that in that map. But, you know, instead of nerfing Divine Shield as should have been done originally, what they did is they made sleep able to hit you through Divine Shield.
Oh, great.
And then sleep would last forever. So now you had 2 spells that were completely fucking busted in every other application.
Well, it's actually, it's way worse if sleep, because for people who don't know, Divine Shield makes you invulnerable. Sleep is cleared by taking damage. So if you sleep an invincible target, then they can't actually escape.
He sits there forever, unable to do anything. But then it turns out to other dumb shit because sleep had insane cast range.
Oh, no.
So for anybody who's not invincible, you can just get caught by sleep out of nowhere, and they can just run up to you and kill you, or wait for their teammates to come and kill you. Like, it created so many more problems than it fixed. So the solution is to nerf them both into the fucking ground. And like,
well, maybe they're just not fundamentally well-designed behaviors, and you should replace them with something more useful and interesting. Yeah, I think anyway.
Yeah, we didn't even know how to, because like Warcraft 3 is such a hard-coded mess, and trying to implement their own physics system or whatever was really off the table. And only recently is HK's really like breaching into the abilities of making like skill shots and stuff like that, and even those are interacting really strangely. But it's like there's so many things in the map, they're just like point and click, suddenly you're silent, slowed, stunned for fucking ever. And it's like there's this horrible branching mess.
Well, listen, I know you can do
things that were implemented to deal with this, to deal with that. Like we had problems with evasion, right? Because evasion is well designed and stuff like that. So someone along the line introduced something that just disables all passives when it's cast on somebody. So that That's so broken. And then then you had evasion and mana shield, and it's like, well, introduce shit that burns mana. So now HK's finally homogenized the mana pools. Now I have this long line trace skill shot thing that if it touches you, it burns literally your entire mana pool on contact.
Okay.
So there's just it's just problems existed and they're going to exist. There's always going to be some balancing issues. And rather than trying to tackle the issues, it's like the knee jerk is to either nerf something into the ground completely uselessness, which for some abilities, maybe they just shouldn't exist to begin with, because if they exist in any context, like stuns, it's always going to be stupidly strong because it takes away control, brings us right back. But then there's other things. It's like we just introduce something to counter something else. And it's just and now you have this other overpowering ability that exists to counter something else. And in all these contexts, it's just now it's a binary interaction and it's ridiculously strong elsewhere on top of it, like the mana burn, long range sleep, and stuns and stuff like that. And then now you're going to have some other problem to deal with that. And it's just like a pull and push and a tug where everything just becomes just absolutely impossible to follow and comprehend. And that's why I say when the first thing you think about when you start getting into control stuff is to make everything as consistent as possible. Because once you establish a standard that this behaves this way, it feels this way to play, you can even make something like acceleration to acceleration tank controls, whatever, you can make them work, as long as the whole system is actually built around it, it feels well to play. But then when you start introducing a whole bunch of other things into the rule set which break away from that convention and say, hey, you can do this without having to be really precise and careful about dealing with your acceleration, then it's something going to cause a huge mess. I know I've heard a lot of very similar issues with a lot of these sim games, like World of Warships or whatever, where they had this consistent platform and then suddenly they introduced something into it like submarines or aircraft carriers. And it just, just because they behave so differently, it fucked the balance for everything completely out the window. Just completely fucked everything. Because they're just so fundamentally different.
Yes.
That the way that it becomes to try to make them work within the existing framework is it just becomes so hard to do. Especially because the existing framework has been something that's been consistently applied to every other piece of content in the game. So it is like this. There's probably 1,000 examples I can think of. I can't really imagine. I mean, I think back to Halo PC. You've played Halo. You remember the rocket launcher in Halo 1. Now, I guess you probably haven't played multiplayer really at all in any of that.
Not since I've played the new release multiplayer, but that's with different. I don't think they have the same netcode issues, although maybe they do. I assume you're going to talk about how you have to lead fucking full vehicles distance.
No, I'm actually going to talk about the difference between the rocket launcher and the fuel rod gun.
Yeah.
Because that's a really big one. So you had a Halo, and then you had Halo PC, the Gearbox bastardization version of it. And Gearbox decided to add in extra stuff. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad idea in itself, but holy fuck. So you have the rocket launcher, and the rocket launcher is basically a one-hit kill AoE. It's about as strong as you can get. The projectiles is quite easily possible to friendly fire yourself and kill yourself. It's a little hard to aim because they're not really lightning fast. And the bigger thing about it is you got 2 shots and then you got to reload. It takes a little while to reload that. If you fuck it up, you can get killed pretty easily, especially if someone's good with a pistol or they got a shotgun and they're close to you. There's a few ways they can get to. Then you got the fuel rod gun. The fuel rod gun has no reload at all. It's energy based like all the other Covenant weapons, which means it does have an overheat, but you can keep a fairly reasonable sustained rate of fire with it. As an arcing shot to it, it still travels reasonably fast. I think it was 4 shots to overheat or something like that. Also AoE. I don't think it did quite as much damage as the rocket launcher, but if I remember, it was a maximum of 2 shots to kill someone, unless you're really getting shitty splash on it. But it was so much easier just to insta-get groups of people with this thing because you could time out your shots a little bit, get massive amounts of shots out of it. You didn't have to. You can't pick up ammo for it. You had. I don't remember the numbers, but I'm pretty sure you could get 20, 30 shots out of one, and it's a lot of damage.
Oh, you compare that to the rocket launcher, by the way, which I think has a max reserve ammo of 6 plus the 2 that are in the chamber. So it's you get 8 shots versus 30 or whatever it is. Yeah.
And since you don't have to worry about reloading or anything like that, it's just a matter of managing your overheat, which is a lot easier to do because you always have to reload with a rocket launcher. It doesn't matter how well you time out your shots. Eventually, you have to go and reload. And with a fuel rod gun, it's just like you just have to recharge. And as long as you're not spamming all your shots at once, you're never going to have to really worry about that. And because it's arcing, it has more utility behind it about being able to hit people behind cover to begin with. And it's just this massively powerful weapon. The flamethrower was also ridiculously powerful. Not as powerful, but if you got anywhere near it, it was just, you're just fucking dead. And like, it was just like the conventions of the weapons became so much more powerful. And not even necessarily like the ideas behind them weren't terrible. It's like, okay, there's these weapons that exist in the game, you may as well add them. Sure thing. But you didn't pay attention to the conventions that were established by the rest of the weapons in the game and what their expressions were. So it's just like, balancing is something that a lot of people in modding are always so scared of, and they talk up, and it's like, oh, it's so difficult to balance stuff. But no, it's always just like apply fucking common sense to it. It's like things are going to be blatantly overpowered really off the bat. When you start like getting in the weeds with something like CMBW, then it can become more difficult because then you're thinking about, what is a skill issue? What is a map issue? Is there like some distinct interaction? Like when you start like actually trying to tweak the individual numbers, it's going to be hard.
Well, there's also an extra
layer. A lot of
that.
this stuff comes down to contextual balance.
The additional layer is that because CMBW has seen so many massive shifts as we continue to experiment with what might be the best sort of model for designing a tech tree and designing a game in terms of its control scheme, in terms of its interactions, in terms of what kinds of things are possible. You know, we're exploring obviously with like the ratio of spellcaster to combat unit is way lower and way more polarized towards combat unit in CMBW than it was in default StarCraft. Like it's a less spellcaster heavy game.
Yeah.
And I think that's like one of the examples of the things I think that's very positive. But I also think that that it actually allows, like one of the reasons why it's positive is that it allows spellcasters to be much more powerful, because now you specifically know that like the average unit is like positional based. If it has a passive or an ability or something, it's, you know, more combat oriented. It's more like, you know, I don't know, like increased speed, or, you know, like the Zor-Yustaleth, which is the 200 mineral, very heavy frontliner from the Zork's Shroud for the Zerg. It's like a tier 1 unit, but it when it takes enough damage, it ends up being basically it ends up like summoning units near it, basically. Like any units that are walking towards it, any allies will get a speed boost. And that's like obviously very positional, and it's also conditional on like the enemies doing enough damage to it, but then not being able to burst it down. So there's like a lot of interesting sort of mind games you can play with that, where, oh, I'm you know, withdrawing my Zor-Yustaleth. Maybe you want to focus it down because otherwise it might, you know, stay alive. That's like a natural thing to do, is like, oh, this guy's trying to kite his low HP unit back, let me attack him. But if it's actually just so that he can summon more units freely or whatever, then that's pretty big. So anyway, like there's all those elements to it, right? Whereas like these units are spellcasters, or are they not spellcasters? And that's like one of the examples. But we've gone through so many iterations where we've changed really sweeping things about the game. Like we've obviously, revised the resource system economically like a lot, and we've revised a lot of other things about it. And it's like, there's just going to be some things that fall through the cracks. And by some things, I mean a lot of things, because, you know, we just have so many different things that change, so many different systems that change or get introduced or whatever. And, you know, obviously we removed upgrades, we removed supply, we do all this other stuff. We're bound to have issues where it's like people just haven't been able to test it in the new model, right? In the new governing model. So when we're sitting down to make our games, as we are right now, it's a lot easier to imagine a more sensible default that you then balance out of with the fine tuning at a later point, because everything's already designed bespoke for the system. Like it's not like it's not like we made a pivot halfway through the game's development or something, right? Like we just kind of knew what we wanted out of the game, and we figured this is our experiment, this is what we're going to do. And like if it doesn't work out, or if we feel like there's more unexplored territory, then well, that's something we can do in our next game or something, right? It's like less about, you know, like the CMBW thing is so experimental and so like back and forth, has such like a weird legacy of changes that that's precisely so that we can be equipped with as many like sort of valid pathways explored as possible, or seemingly valid pathways explored, so that when we just sit down and make some games, like they can have their own arguments for where the RTS genre could go as like a medium or whatever. And so I think that also is naturally going to leave CMBW in a weird spot where like there's probably going to be some stuff that never actually gets balanced because it never gets, explored. Like right now it's like individual units, but eventually it'll be like compositions of a bunch of units that like were never played with together in that exact thing or whatever, right? And that's obviously going to be like the computational explosion or combinatorial explosion of like how many different things you can combine together is going to be pretty massive. And I just don't worry about that because like to me there's too many things that are like I almost have like absolved myself of like the responsibility to make sure every single last thing is balanced purely because there's no way you could really do that if you're changing the system so many times, right? Like that's more important or that's more disruptive to the idea that you're going to balance everything than, it's way worse to be in a situation for that than it is to be in a situation where it's like, oh, I just have, some units that have a little bit of a rough stat or something. Like I can just change the stat, but like if it's because of a system, I may not know how to change the stat or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I disabled dash canceling for this set of changes in this is because, I'm going to give that a chance, but I need to go back to the framework I was familiar with, then make sweeping changes to that framework and then go back. Because that's why, like I said, I'm at the stage where I'm not even thinking about adding content right now. Like I was working on, you might have seen a couple units in the map there that have not been shown yet that I haven't wired up or anything besides some of the retargeting for, but it's like I stopped and I thought, I don't really want to get into this. Not right now, not when I'm halfway through trying to just take an axe to the character's movement system right now. Because that's going to set the pace for everything else. And it's also kind of like why I gave up on trying to really segregate the movesets and make everything distinct. Because it's like, it's pretty obvious from the play styles that people are going to just tend towards stuff that they feel is appropriate anyways. So I'm never going to really achieve an absolutely perfect balance with that, especially when I can't control the assets. So it's like, well, I'm going to aim for something where everything feels appropriately powerful, compared to what each of the individual performances, and then not worry as much about fine tuning that. So I'm just like kind of, before I was really emphasized, like before the first voyage, I was pretty emphasized on making those numbers not like needle point balanced, but fairly consistent. Now it's like I'm just focusing exclusively on how it feels to actually play. So there was a couple things I showed there that I only added in this morning, and I'm already going to change them.
Oh, okay.
But like the second Ragnarok attack come past, it was one of the new animations you would have seen. It's doesn't move you forward enough. I need something different. And then I have some other ideas I'm not so sure about yet that I'm not sure how to add. I was actually just doing a look through all my animations and trying to figure out what I do have, and it's like I don't think I have what I need. So, but the general control changes, it's like it's all about just consistency. And with CMBW is like, because things are volatile, it's always going to throw up all these individual changes. Like when you change the balance of a unit's damage or whatever, and then obviously as you've experienced, then you go and change a tech tree, it's like it kind of invalidates all of your other work.
Yes.
Now it's like, well, now the balance of everything's completely
at the very least you have to re-examine the unit from almost like from first principles and be like, does it even make sense for this concept? Like the Gorgon used to have its attacks refreshed the timer of debuffs, which is like, and I thought it was an interesting idea, but Terran doesn't really have debuffs at tier 1 or tier 2. And so, like, I mean, I guess they kind of did when the Southpaw existed, but that was, revised later. So anyway, like, yeah, all right, debuffs don't really work. Like, that's maybe a team game thing, but it's like very weird and niche to have it on your mainstay, like default air unit, which is the combat role or whatever that Gorgon was supposed to have. And so then I just made it so that it had the old Southpaw passive where it applied a stacking slow the more times it hit you, which is maybe a bit more in line with the unit's name and mythology anyway. But the concept of the Gorgon doing what it does is like, okay, well now, so that like that was part of the concept revision when I stuffed it into tier 2. And then, eventually we made it tier 2.5, and like obviously we had to adjust a bunch of stats and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, that's going to be a very easy example of like, your previous work to balance the unit and make it an interesting choice may, more often than not, will not actually apply and do the same thing here. It might be, too powerful or too weak, or it might just be overshadowed by something else. Yeah, like that's the other thing, is that we keep adding more stuff. Like, well, does it all feel like it belongs and like does its own combat role? Or like, there's going to be a lot of overlap between combat roles. Like at the end of the day, a lot of stuff does damage, but it's like, how do you get to the point where it does damage? And if it feels very similar, then it's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's going to be a lot of other differences where it's like, well, this unit is more spammable but less durable than the other unit or whatever. Like, okay, well, they can accomplish different things, and then maybe you access this unit compositionally in a different way, but they should still probably stand out enough that you feel like your decision to build, unit A that is a ranged attacker versus unit B that is a ranged attacker was informed because of the differences between those two, despite the fact that they have a similar combat role. It's like, either this one's easier to get from the rest of my strategy because it's built from a similar structure, or, the unit is, better suited because of like some specific quirk to it or a passive or something. Like there should be something informing your decision to get one unit over the other, instead of just being like, well, I guess I just needed a unit that does that thing. Ideally, as people get more familiar with the tech tree and as the units become a little bit more, Viek described it as being polarized towards a role in particular. And it's like, some units maybe are a little bit too general purpose and again, don't have as much of an identity as they could. And as we get, correct that error, so to speak, in some cases, which I think I'll do a little bit more with the later tier units than anything, because I think the earlier tier units being a bit more generalist probably helps with responding to like really wacky, openings or whatever. If you have too specialized a unit, then it will feel pretty bad if you just get blind countered or what have you. Or maybe it'll be too much like a hard counter, like you were talking about that with the TGS map, and it's like, yeah, let me just do this to do that, and that's not very interesting. And you can get into that situation if unintentionally. It's not like you're designing it around the idea that this will counter that, but if the combat role is too polarized, then it can get, or the unit role, I should say, because sometimes it's not combat, sometimes it's support or whatever, definitely can get to a point where it's a little bit rough to, it's like very, very specialized. And so I think like that's one of the reasons why the tier 1, non-combatants are all like enchanters or support units or whatever. It's like, here's a unit that heals with, like, you got 2 healers at tier 1 for Terran, and you got the protector from the Anseal. And it's like, the reason why that's the case is because, it's a little bit too early to have some non-combatant disruptor caster unit or whatever that specifically does, something that, dethrones enemy units, or it's like, the reason why the Cantavis is tier 2, right? It basically is like, yeah, here's Psystorm is like, this blanket of damage. It's best against like crowds of units that have low HP, or maybe against like stationary targets if you can get them in enough, although usually stationary are artillery and stuff, so maybe not as good there, but like you get the idea. It's like you have this sort of heuristic where it's like, can you achieve a good role distribution between a series of units? And if you can, then you'll be in a pretty good spot, I think, to, have you're basically giving your players a series of tools and tasking them with understanding the game deeply enough to know which tools will be maybe not optimal, but just better or good for their composition and playstyle. And also having a sufficient breadth of tools where it's not just one choice that is valid. Because I think one of the really good things about CMBW is that maybe this is a little bit less true right now for Terran, but for the vast majority of matchups and cases, especially in team games, you feel like you could do a few different things and still be playing towards, your preferred play style or strategy, instead of it just being like, well, I really like to turtle up, so I'm just always going to go, phalanxes or whatever. Like there's a number of options right now. We have Sentinels, now we have Madrigals, now we have, some of the air units. Like there's many options that you can choose. And like, I think the more breadth we provide, then it's like, you don't really even ultimately get to the same destination because of the differences between the units, but you are in a different, like the fact that you can have so many different experiences, I think is like, that's the basic idea of why it's valuable to explore a deep and expansive tech tree, right? So I think there's a lot there, despite all of the issues with like redesigning a bunch of stuff or adding stuff that potentially invalidates previous work. Thankfully, the good qualities still shine through, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention, is that it's not just about having identity for everything spread across. It's also about facilitating different play styles, which you can't really do if you have a very limited tech tree to begin with, or everything is really hyper specialized. because, it just kind of waters down all the choices that you can make. And that's kind of the reasons why I was changing numbers in this and taking back, and kind of like, well, there's many reasons why I'm changing stagger, not just because it's really strong, but also because I wanted it to be more mobile in general. And also because I kind of like accepted that there's going to be like, because like I said, when I said before, I was really surprised at the different play styles that did develop between the players in this. In Apex X, when it was very clear that you played completely different than HKS, and you both were playing completely different than me, and it was like I was really surprised by that, because I was like, I was tending towards stuff because I knew what the numbers were, and nobody else knew what the numbers were, other than what the tutorial menu thing told you, that this was biased to that. You didn't know the actual numbers, you just knew that stuff was stronger, and that didn't really matter. You both found your own ways to kind of like exploit things and do things anyways. And it was like, I kind of just like accepted at that point that people will always tend towards things that they feel is better, or that they feel more comfortable with doing. Like in CMBW, I am more comfortable with it turns out I'm more comfortable being an asshole, really, and not really trying to do the same kind of timing attacks that other people were doing, and tending towards air units or whatever, or economic play. And it's like, you have different ways to do that, and they turned out to be really different than what other people were doing, at least at the time. And having those options available, this is the whole part of expression in gaming, and really anything, is having the options, and having those options be, really relatively consistent to the point you know really what to expect. And your opponent will also know what to expect when they see it, when they encounter it, when they play against it. Everything is sort of has that, the way that they behave, the way they move. They have their own identity, but they all follow the same sort of rule set to an extent. And consistency is established by the conventions that you make. So even if you break some established conventions, like, the Zergling can morph into the Vulvacore, and that's weird because everything else requires tech. Well, now you have established the convention that the Zergling is a standout unit, because it is different now. It behaves differently. It has different abilities, and now it can morph into something that in itself is different. So in the context of something like, for example, within Brood War, where the Zergling doesn't morph into anything, or StarCraft 2, where you require the Baneling Nest to turn it into butter, and then everything else requires their own tech, now you no longer have a convention, but you've created your own convention by doing this already, and that's part of the joys of just completely rebuilding everything, and then having some sort of resemblance to something else, is that you're going to have people walking into this with some established convention from the old project, like, say, for example, how mines behave. And then that's going to be completely broken by this. And I think that's really what breaks a lot of people with Apex X, is they come into it from, the case of like HKS, for example. He would commonly say, I haven't really played games like this except for DMC way back, and maybe DMC4. And it's like, I'm thinking, it was probably more like Demon Souls that you played not that long ago, and cheese the ever-loving fuck up. But then he played that as a caster, so that isn't even a good reflection either. And it's like, there is no real anything that's like this at all. Period. It's just too different. And that's the same case when you go into something like CMBW, is there's just no cross-reference for this. So you're establishing all your own conventions, and is something you're going to face is, obviously you're going to be well aware of this because it's just the sheer amount of cancer that exists within the RTS, is that people are going to walk into this, and they're going to walk into your games with these conventions from these products that should have never entered the market whatsoever. They should have never existed. Like, StarCraft 2 should never exist. No one in their right mind would ever publish something like Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2 if they had even the slightest shred of self-respect. But they did. Unfortunately, they did. And people have played those heaping piles of shit. People have played those awful campaigns. And now people expect every other RTS to be like either Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2. You've seen it whenever Fagado comes over and just pukes on your lap. It's like a cat that comes to your doorstep. Instead of giving you a dead rat or something because it thinks you're too shitty to hunt for yourself. It literally just comes up, it just fucking throws up on you and walks away. It thinks you're having too good of a day. Here, have some puke on your lap. Bye. And that is what Faggoto does whenever he posts these screenshots from Reddit or whatever. It's just, he goes out of his way to find these complete blithering imbeciles. And that's the audience you're going to be marketing towards. And unfortunately, it's probably a lot of audience going to drag up and end up in here trying to play a CMBW because of the cast or whatever. You have the one individual who's whinging about his fucking RTS legacy coming from CNC of all things. Yes, some RTS legacy. Obviously, the expectations that he had were completely different than the actual application. Something about a failed proxy barracks or something like that. I don't know. That gave me a good hoot. But that's the thing is, you have to find some way to break down what people expect out of something. And then you don't have to worry too much about having some outliers within your own framework, because if those outliers all make sense, then that's the consistency you've established. So that's why I wanted Stagger to behave completely the same for the player and the enemies. The values were going to be different. Some enemies were going to have less, some enemies were going to have more. But the general fundamentals of if you get hit while your Stagger is low, you're going to be stunned and you're going to be continued to stun. That was what I wanted to keep consistent. But then, it reached a point where I actually started implementing content, and I was like, yeah, this idea is not actually going to work. I have to rethink the whole thing. So now I'm like, okay, so the enemy is just fully restored to Stagger after the animation is done, and stun can be obtained. I don't think I actually managed to really show that, and that with those weeds, it's kind of hard to show because their animations are not very distinct. But there is a stun animation where if you hit them enough times while they're staggered, it triggers a stun animation, so it's sort of similar, but not. For the player, that is still there, but you do not have the stagger regeneration that they do, which means that now the system's completely broken. You can't even look at it the same way anymore. The interaction is totally different. And it's like before, that really would have been something I would never have even considered. I didn't want to consider it because I wanted that consistency, because I viewed it as that you are going to interact with them the same way as they're going to interact with you. But then it became quite clear that those interactions were not healthy for the game. And rather than try to cling to something and try to make it work, I'm just going to just break the whole thing. Take what parts of it I want to keep, like the way it actually just functions mechanically speaking. I'm going to try something very different. And it's all not pursuing mathematical perfection or complete and total balance, but rather is that this just didn't really feel that good. You stunlock Schwa to death, and it's just like, well, now you don't even experience most of the fight. Or you get stunlocked to death in a COD or whatever, and it's like, well, I guess I fucked up. And now I'm going to lose everything. Like, neither of those interactions are particularly good for the same reasons, just applied in different contexts. How can I break that while keeping the rest of the game fundamentally the same, in which don't stand in this, don't get stun locked, and be able to take advantage of enemies in vulnerable spaces? There's certainly ways to do it. They just haven't been explored by anyone yet. So in my case, I'm still kind of at the point where everything is ridiculously volatile, and I'm just like throwing dicks at a wall until something sticks. And that's probably going to go for a long time, because I have no precedent to go off of for an ARPG system that actually works well. I just have a lot of like semi-related things I can draw context from. At least in your case, going into like Antikythera and stuff like that, you have CMBW's experiences and all the other mods' experiences, all my experiences and everything else to go by. And now you're really getting this feedback of what this is going to look like however long from now. You reach a point where you're just trying to balance that. Now you're just retracing your footsteps again. And now you have that understanding. And that's really what balance is all about. It's about just knowing kind of what to expect out of a given change. And then you kind of look ahead from that change and you think, okay, how will this affect that? I think that's one of the problems that a lot of people, again, in mods had with balancing, why they were so afraid of it, is that they only ever think of things in that same respect that we had problems with in TGS, where they just think about just the problem in front of them, not the context of a body or the ripple effect of what their changes are going to do, which is, again, why you look at these games like StarCraft 2 with huge sweeping changes coupled with constant going back and forth on shit like Widow Mines, is they don't know what to do and they don't understand the context of their changes because none of them are actually involved in the actual game. So every time they change something, it fucks up something else. Then they're constantly chasing this tail of something that, like, the whole thing just needs to be rethought out from the ground up to fix it. Like, they avoid the problem rather than just biting the bullet and addressing it. It's like, this unit can't work because it's just fundamentally busted. And you can't just keep tweaking these things around trying to find this golden balance. It's not going to happen. It's just the utility or whatever is just too fucking strong. You've got to rethink it out because it's dumb.
Yeah, I mean the disruptor with the indicators, the Phoenix and the Cyclone that have the like fire while moving lock on shit or whatever. It's like these aren't really, you're not even really microing. You know what I mean? You're just like, no. It's like point and click, or it's, you know, I don't know. I think with the disruptor, you can even change it after it's out or something. I don't remember how it works, but it's just like whatever it is like really, really lame. And it's a case where, yeah, like automating the attacking part or, you know, making it super smooth and responsive in some way or whatever has actually made the game worse in those, when it comes to the interactions with those units, because, you know, now it's like, here's you thought clumping was the solution. Well, here's a unit that just erases everything that's clumped up. It's like, well,
yeah, that's when I was playing competitively regularly. For me, that was the infestor.
Right.
Once you got enough infestors out, there was very little anyone can do about them unless they were very, very good with ghosts. And that's that stupid binary interaction. The ghost can just snipe your infestors.
Oh, yeah, and High Templar can feedback the ghosts. And
it's like you're nuking their armies with the aids. They're nuking your infestors with a point and click that's on SmartCast, so they require like 2 APM to make the most out of it. And everything else is just like dying. And it's just like you just enter this interaction where it's just like two heaping piles of shit just slathering against each other. It's like the unholy trinity, the Marauder, Roach, Immortal, they just have to exist because the others exist. And it's just extraordinarily unhealthy for any exploration of the game. You have to use these. The whole game is built around this interaction. There is no exploration, no decision making, no play style. It's just, this is it. You either interact with this or you just don't play.
Yeah, you know, talking on this thread reminded me that, and maybe this is something we'll explore in the next episode or something, as we're coming to the end here. But something that has been floated before by both like members of the dev team and by people, just the average pleb, basically, is like they might see our design philosophy to have these crazy tech tiers, and that, you know, they like, you know, I mentioned before, like it would be really good if we could manage, you know, 10 bases, you know, get to a point where you're managing like crazy numbers of bases, have lots of money, you know, exploring this like very deep 10-tier tech tree or whatever. It's like that's sort of the somewhat vague, somewhat specific picture of, you know, what we want Cosmonarchy Retail to look like, which might be our third or fourth RTS game that we ever make, by the way. Is like we're sort of scaling up to be able to actually tackle that and explore.
Not 12, by the way.
Not 12, by the way. But 3 times 4 is 12, so I guess I got you there.
That's also 3.
It is 3. So the thing that I look at from that is like, here's this game that we want to make, and it's all about this massive scale, but like we're not going to implement smart casting, right? We're not going to implement, you know, all this automation stuff. And people have said like, okay, well, if that's your thought now, then how are we possibly going to manage 10 bases and an army and you know, in all these different locations and stuff? And you know, like in my head, I just think if you're good enough to get to the point where you can actually get to a point where you're making 10 bases, you know what I mean? Like, you know, if it's an even skill matchup, then the absence of something like smart casting or the absence of, you know, some other automation, like, you know, Vic and I were debating whether to have, you know, cycling the command card using tab to change what active abilities are present or whatever. And you know, we got into this, like we were starting to like break down exactly what it means to like issue an order, and like there was all this like hair splitting about, you know, what is it automation or is it not, and like how do we do it? Because his position was that it would just make it so that you could actually manage your army, but I was thinking of it in the macro sense, like then you just put all your production structures onto one control group, and it might be a noob trap where if you do that and you like press a button like, oh, my 10 barracks just lit up and now I have no money for my fulcrums. It's like, yeah, well, that could happen. And so you might as well just not even use the system as you initially thought it was supposed to be used. And it feels like this training wheel that gives you, it's like worker automation almost, is like gives you the wrong sort of lesson to take away from it, because it enables this like, you know, poorer play that actually like shoots you in the foot or whatever. And so then you just start asking questions like, is it, you know, maybe you just learn to not use it that way, but that's how most people are going to use it when they're new, and maybe you just have to accept that, and like new players will eventually learn to get better and stuff. So like we were talking about stuff like that. We were talking about smart casting, and it's like I just don't think that you need these systems which automate the act of selecting a unit, or, well, in both cases, they automate the action of selecting a specific unit and or a specific unit type. And I don't think you need that automation in order to achieve scale, which seems to be the premise of a lot of people who maybe doubt the idea that you could actually get to a point where you're managing 10 bases and whatnot with, maybe they doubt that you could do that without the automation or whatever. I think you can. Like, it's a question of, are you skilled enough to do it? And like, can you actually get to a point where you have, a solid somewhere between 200 and 400 APM at the highest level? Like, can you manage all of those bases and manage the scale? Like, the whole idea is that we want to earn the scale that we eventually get to, not we want to, make it super easy to get to that scale. Because if you make it super easy with that automation, in my opinion, and my fear is you trivialize a lot of the engagements at a smaller scale level, right? Because now you're dealing with...
Well, it's the case for Brood War, right? I mean, there's definitely been competitive games with huge numbers of bases.
Right. Yeah, well, that's fair. And they obviously...
It's not common, right? And it takes it takes exceptional games to reach that point, but people at that skill level have the ability to manage that, for sure.
Well, even in you remember
that is more difficult to do.
We had this TVT match on Proxima, which is the Twilight map Vik made, an older version of it that was a lot bigger. And we were both playing Terran, and it was the game that ended because of some ion cannon crash, unfortunately. But like, we both had like 5 or 6 bases each, and it's like, we're not very good players, so it's not like you actually need a crazy amount of APM to do it. This is with, worker wandering and, dumb rally, if you want to call it that, and like all this other stuff. Like, we could still do it. Like, it's not difficult. Like, I'm at maybe 180, 200 APM or whatever. It's like it's not actually that difficult to do. And APM in this case is just like a stand-in for like precision or speed or whatever. It's like more important if you just know that you have to do these things and you check in. Like, your actual APM isn't going to move the needle as much as you being aware of what you should focus whatever your APM is on. And that's always the lesson that people learn when they're playing an RTS game. So I think you can achieve the scale organically, perhaps would be a word for it, instead of automatically. Like, the fact that you just achieve scale in StarCraft 2, sort of. I mean, not really. It's smaller scale than Brood War a lot of the times. But the scale that you do get to in StarCraft 2, it's like it happens as a matter of course. It doesn't happen because like, a specific decision was made. Like, I guess if you want to talk about cheeses in 1v1s or whatever, then you can choose to cheese and then keep the scale really low, or you can choose to not cheese and then like the scale gets to whatever it gets to. But like, people will max out their supply limit, which, I mean, that just saying supply and limit in the same sentence is really bad. But people will max themselves out at like 8 minutes in or something, or even less. And it's like, that's way more compressed than in Brood War. But even in Brood War, you have like a 2.5 minute tier 2 timing for Zerg where they start their lair at that point or whatever. It's like, what? Like, how are you... Like, at this point, you're taking the already very small tech tree and you're making it suit... Like, the meta has developed based on the maps and how many resources are available and all this other shit, has developed in such a way where you actually have such a small amount of time spent, even at the pro level of Brood War, which is like the game where we talk about the early game being really important. Like, but even that has been condensed super heavily, where like the early game is like 2 minutes long or something, or whatever. Like, you existing at tier 1 is like very, very short. And, obviously a change recently in CMBW has been, a lot of them has been made towards like making it so you can stay at tier 1 era technology for a decent amount of time, like say 8 to 10 minutes, and not be throwing the game.
Or DF, you can stay at it for like 30 minutes.
True. Hey, he was no, never mind. He would never have won.
He was actually competitive until like the tier 3 infantry started coming out.
Yeah. Well,
it's testimony to his conviction, that's for sure.
Yeah, when he...
And it can work. Yeah. Like, I feel like that if he had just been more conscious of when to attack you, how to attack you, and how to defend his bases, he might have actually been able to pull a win in that first game with nothing but dragons.
Yeah, and then I dropped 2 madrigals in his mineral line and his workers evaporated.
Yeah, and then he lost like 50, 60 workers or something.
It's pretty rough. I mean, that's why I actually, like, this is another thing that's completely unrelated, but Kian was spectating a game between the two, actually DF and myself, I believe. And he just, like, I had the recent changes where it shows selections, but it doesn't show witness selection anymore. So we don't have to worry about selecting like a burrowed unit or something and giving it away.
Yeah, that was funny.
And it also like will now force on the order lines. And this also is true in replays and stuff. So, and single player replays will show you selections as well instead of only multiplayer ones. Like all this stuff that just got like cleaned up yesterday. And Kian experienced that, and he was just like, when your fucking Brood War mod has a better observer interface than StarCraft 2 or something like that. I don't know that it's actually very, like, there's no production tab, and there's like some other stuff that we don't get to see, like in remastered. I don't know if this is true in the observer mode, but I know in replays you get to see their actual camera positions, and that would be really cool to see in the minimap and stuff.
Yeah, that would be nice. So, I think Warcraft 3 might have that, or some very shitty resemblance of it that they built on.
Yeah, just being able to get more information. And then I would also like to show,
I think that's what I did a lot in StarCraft 2 later on when I was doing those Warlords replays, was just that to first person, and it does give you a lot of context about, you know, what they're looking at or whatever.
Well, even just being able to see their like viewport in the mini map or whatever, which is what remastered does, would give you indication of what they're looking at any given time, and that would be nice. So, you know, there's all sorts of things we want to like make the player colors select the selection circle be player colored. We want to make all sorts of stuff like that, so you get more information as to who specifically is selecting it. I'm actually, I haven't tested whether or not witness selections are saved in the replays. I tried to prohibit that, but I haven't been able to test that. So like, there's all sorts of stuff that might still be a problem. But anyway, the main idea that I take away from that is like, you know, just providing that information is really good for Cass, and obviously, you know, like you were talking earlier about the people who are going to step in and try to defend their RTS legacy and then rage quit, is like I just think about that, like, that's going to be inevitable. I mean, people haven't really played an RTS.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if you've played only RTSs released, like games with the RTS label released after like the year 2000 or whatever, like, you probably haven't really, I mean, like maybe Age of Empires, like you can, it's a very different kind of game, but you can say that like that is an RTS. Sure, I wouldn't contest that, but like,
listen, there's people out there who think Dota is an RTS. They're beyond salvation.
Well, though, yeah,
it's
like
called a new.
There's no fucking RTS games being released, so let's just start possessing other genres.
Yeah.
Well, Dota came from an RTS, so that means it's like ancestrally an RTS, bro, like genetically or something.
Because Warcraft 3 was an RTS.
Yeah. So I guess that brings us to the closing remarks here. Obviously, this episode was mostly dictated around or directed around control and unit handling and obviously player inputs and stuff, which I thought it was elucidating to see your process or hear about your process and see the demo and stuff for Apex X and how things have changed. And obviously, we talked a lot about like, you know, all sorts of stuff related to CMBW and RTS games and whatnot. But do you have any sort of closing remarks on, like, to sum up your opinions on control and any sort of things that we touched on that maybe didn't get enough unpacking in your opinion?
It's kind of hard to think when my brain's a little fried, but it's like the way I feel about control, especially when it comes to Apex, is it shouldn't feel like you are playing a game in the sense that you have a layer of abstraction. Things that happen should feel like they happen for a reason, whether it would be something that would be objectively referred to as something that inhibits control. It should feel like it is there for a reason and is expected and doesn't incite frustration. So the few things that ever disrupt control, they should do so for very explicit reasons. So when I think about, like, ever since Warcraft 3 came out and the whole MBS multi-select thing, and then the tab selection, for example, came out, I've seen so many people arguing about these.
Yeah.
And I feel like most of the arguments against them are really bad. Like, really bad. And for a long time, I was on the fence that I didn't feel like they should be there. But a lot of the arguments that I saw people making against them, I felt were
they
bad.
didn't really hold pass muster, right?
Yeah. In my view, it was something like, you know, I always had the aversion to automation and automated mining and stuff like that. So that was something I always just inherently avoided as much as possible. But the multi-building select was something that was like, I felt like that it would be fine if the rest of the game was good. Well, Warcraft 3 wasn't good. Everybody knew Warcraft 3 wasn't good. So you couldn't really assess multi-building select in really any objective sense because the framework in which you were experiencing it from was shit. So how could you possibly really wager how much it actually changes the game? And I think the same is the case with like tabbing through the army for abilities or whatnot. Well, in Warcraft 3 sense, it makes more sense because literally everything has active abilities.
Right.
And you only have like 2 buildings at any point in that game. So it's not really that big of a deal. I think I would be interested to see it within CMBW, but only in a world where unlimited unit selection also existed. Because at this point in time, I don't think there's a reason for it to exist. When it comes to something like Antikythera or whatever, I can't even begin to imagine. It's something I can't even begin to comment. Because I think every single change you make to the user experience, whether it's something you do with the user interface or whatever, it is all part of a synthesis. They are all related to each other. And there's places where these things can absolutely exist and thrive, and places where they just don't really contribute that much. And when it comes to stuff like what the player does to interact with his units, whether it be the 12 unit, by the way, selection, or unlimited selection, or multi-building select, or not multi-building select, I think that none of these inherently are extremely bad or necessarily very positive either. They're all contextually sensitive. In the sense of like typical Brood War, I really never cared too much about the unit selection. My projects never had, unit extenders to that much. So never even thought of going beyond, I wanted to go beyond the unit limit. And of course, Armageddon Onslaught hit that a lot. But never had reached a point where we were looking at the stage where I felt like I was really inhibited by these user interface elements. And that's what I would like. I mean, I guess if I had access to the source or had ASM knowledge and was reverse engineering myself, I probably would have eventually reassessed those things. But in the window of what I had, it didn't feel like that was the thing that was limiting me. But now, in CMBW, the context has changed. Yes. Supply is no longer a thing. You build more production structures immediately out of the gates. It's much more production structure focused. You have more number focus in terms of the amount of units. Now a lot of these things, they feel like they will belong much more in this. Contextually, you feel like you want these things. So that's when I think about controls, is at what point does it feel like not just like what turns into animation, but also what it feels like. It feels like you should have more control, or something feels like it would belong here. And then, like MBS just was natural. It just felt, you put that in, and once you get used to it, it's just, you don't think about it anymore. It's the same as supply. Once supply is gone, you don't even think about it anymore. Other things takes its place. The game travels much more fast in terms of the macro sense. The production is more important. The economic is more important, requires more of your attention. Supply has no reason to exist here anymore. And then my concept that I was running out for StarCraft, a project in a hypothetical world in which all these extenders existed and I had all these other assets, I was going to take things in a completely different standpoint. And the way I was going to do supply was basically like power generation for structures. And the way which things would have existed there also would have been just completely different. And in that world, MBS would exist. And if you had mentioned such things to people in these communities 20 years ago like that, they would have just gone fucking ballistic. They would have been like, oh no, you can't have MBS. It's going to ruin the game. Right. But, I come from the background that I'm really, really adverse to change. And at the same time, I never saw a reason not to have these things. So, but automation is really straight out. When we go to the game, automatically mining for you, automatically rallying everything onto minerals and harvesting for you, the game starts, it's already playing itself. Smart casting is a really big one. I mean, in some cases, within the context of the examples given, smart casting made sense. But that was because spellcasters was such a fucking chore to use and they weren't very fun to actually play. So the smart casting automated what amounted to be a chore. The only reason smart casting existed was because the game was shit. The second you take out the fact that the game was shit, smart casting doesn't stand on its own legs anymore. Why would you have the game decide about how to use your own units? The whole fucking point of playing the game is to play the fucking game. So control your own fucking units, for Christ's sakes. And the units aren't interesting or too fucking strong or too stupid that you need to have smart casting to make them viable in a casual or competitive environment. There is no difference. Then it's time to just delete everything and start over.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I suppose that will sum up our opinions on control. I'm sure, this is a big topic, obviously, we could come back to. I'm sure it'll filter out through the next little bit, but definitely interested in seeing like where all of this stuff goes, right? Where your Apex X project goes as a result of the changes you've made to the control scheme and to how responsive stuff is. And with the changes that we're continuing to make in CMBW and I guess the iterations on the formula that we are deploying to Antikythera. I think all of those things are going to be, I mean, it just is something that unfortunately is not done enough. We don't see enough movement in this space. We don't see enough people recognizing the lackluster quality level of the status quo and seeking an alternative.
I don't see any.
Yeah, it's pretty much just us as far as, I mean, there are people out there who are doing stuff differently. My brother found a game on Steam that was like, it in the very description of the game, it was railing against like microtransactions and stuff. This is like the first time I've ever seen that before. So yeah, I mean, like whatever. I mean, there's going to be some people out there who still believe somewhat similarly to us, at least in some cases. But like, you know, I just look at it like, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing, because the rest of the world is often fucking crazy, we might as well just keep up keep lighting the torch. You know, all those torches in all those hallways, they get lit somehow. We got to keep lighting them, and that's sort of how I feel. Is like just keep carrying on this flame and until it I don't know, lights us up and smokes
until
a doobie.
We set ourselves on fire and die screaming.
I was just gonna say smoke weed, but you know.
Oh yeah, same thing. I mean, you're smoking weed while you're on fire.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, in that case, smoke weed.
Smoke weed.